Hello students, welcome to the video lecture series conducted under Gyandoot program initiated by Commissionerate of College Education, Government of Rajasthan. I am Dr. Kiran, Associate Professor in English, posted at Chaudhry Baluram Godara Government Girls College, Sri Ganganagar. Today, in this lecture, I am going to talk about an eminent English poet, G.M. Hopkins. This lecture is divided into three parts. In first part, we will have a brief introduction with life and works of G.M. Hopkins. In part 2, we will try to have an understanding of the salient features of Hopkins' poetry and his contribution to English poetry. And in the third part, there will be a brief analysis of his poems for a better understanding of the ways how his creativity responded to his surroundings and the literary techniques and the devices he used to record his impressions into his poems. And the two poems which will be analyzed in this section are Spring and Fall and The Sea and the Skylark. So students, let's begin. Students, full name of G.M. Hopkins is Gerard Manley Hopkins. Chronologically, he belongs to Victorian era, means he is a Victorian poet. But a close analysis, a close reading of his poetry reveals that there are the seeds of modern poetry. And another important thing about him to know is that he is a priest poet. Hopkins was born on 28th July 1844 in the London suburb of Stratford at Essex in England. He was the eldest of 9 children to Manley Hopkins and Catherine Hopkins, a prosperous and artistic couple. Students, his father was by turn the proprietor of a marine insurance firm, a church warden, and above all, a published writer and reviewer. And his mother, she was greatly fond of music and reading. So we can say that his interest in poetry he inherited from his parents. And this great creative genius died of typhoid fever in 1869 at Dublin. As far as his education is concerned, Hopkins learned the basic skills of reading and writing at home, and his formal education started at Highgate School, where he remained from 1854 to 1863. Later on, he joined Balliol College, Oxford, where he studied under the supervision of Benjamin Jowett and Walter Pater, and he studied in this college from 1864 to 1867, and he was one of the brilliant students of the college, and in 1867 he won first class degree in classics, and he was considered the star of Balliol by his teacher Benjamin Jowett. Later on, he converted to Roman Catholicism under the influence of John Henry Newman, and in 1868 he entered Jesuit order. And students, as a part of his training for priesthood, he studied philosophy and theology at St. Bruno's College, North Wales. And finally, 1877, he was ordained to priesthood. And students, as we are to study G.M. Hopkins as a poet, so it is imperative for us to know about the formative influences on his creative talent. Students, the first influence was that of his parents. As I have told you that both of his parents, they were fond of poetry and music, and they were deeply religious too. So the blend of aesthetic and ascetic strains in his personality is something which he inherited from his parents. And another important influence on his life was that of his teacher, Walter Pater. And the third important influence is John Henry Newman. We have already discussed that it is just because of John Henry Newman that he bent towards Roman Catholicism. Another important impact is that of Duns Scotus, a philosopher, his theory of principle of individuation. We will talk about the influence of Duns Scotus in detail further. And another important influence on his life is that of his maternal aunt, Maria Smith, who gave her first lessons of sketching and painting. And it is just the influence of his aunt that he decided to be a painter poet like Rossetti. Students, let's have a quick overview of G.M. Hopkins' journey as a poet. He started writing poetry from his school and he won a Headmaster's Poetry Prize for his poem The Escorial at Highgate School. And later on, the entries in diaries and sketchbooks from 1862 to 1866 reveal his love for nature and his perception of images and words, which prepare the ground of immature poetry. Then the period from 1868 to 1875 is the period of silence in his journey as a poet, because this was the time when he joined Jesuit order and he thought that writing poetry is not something in tune with his duties as a priest, and he even burnt all the verses which he has written before 68. But later on, when his superiors asked him to write an elegy for the 5 Franciscan nuns who died in a shipwreck, then he wrote his poem, The Wreck of Deutschland, in 1875. And another important part of his journey as a poet is his stay at Dublin as professor of Greek literature at University College, Dublin. And during his stay at Dublin, he was not um, comfortable with the life at Dublin. So in a mood of depression and despair, he wrote these poems. And just on the basis of mood and the subject matter of these 6 sonnets are called terrible sonnets or sonnets of desolation. Another very important thing to be kept in mind is that this great creative genius, this great poet, was not published in his lifetime. His poems were published posthumously after 30 years after his death. And these poems were published by his friend Robert Breezes, who himself was an eminent poet. Students, let's have a look at some famous poems by G.M. Hopkins. The first one is The Wreck of Deutschland, which we have just discussed. Then another is Spring and Fall, then Terrible Sonnets, The Sea and the Skylark, God's Stranger, Pied Beauty, The Wind Hover. These are to name a few, but there are many more in his collection. Students, let's talk about the salient features of Hopkins' poetry. First and foremost, his poetry reveals his love for nature. His poems are replete with nature portrayal. Then secondly, the devotional element. Being a religious poet, being a priest poet, the celebration of God's glory is there in his poems. The complexity and the Victorian spirit of restlessness is also expressed through his poetry. His poems are full of vivid and striking imagery. There are wonderful, um, picturesque portrayal of his surroundings. And another innovative aspect of his poetry is inscape and instress. We will talk about these two concepts in detail. And his poetry is also known for his experimentation in diction and style, use of compound words, unusual metaphors, archaic words, alliteration, assonance, and internal rhyme. These are the part of his experiments. And we will talk about that in the two poems, Spring and Fall and the Sea and the Skylark, that how this experimentation is used in those very poems also. And lastly, his another innovation, his greatest contribution to English prosody is the sprung rhythm, which is called to be the seed of free verse. Now, let's have a detailed introduction with the concept of inscape. Students, inscape is actually based on the idea of Scottish philosopher Duns Scotus, who gave the principle individuation, and he told that every object, animate or inanimate, has its own individuality, and this individuality was described by him as thisness. And this is this thisness only which gives everything, every object, its identity. Means this thisness is a sort of a design, a pattern, a specific design which creates the individual identity of every object. And it is this distinctive design, this distinctiveness of the design is the idea which is based on a theological belief that God never repeats himself. So we can say indirectly this concept of inscape is the celebration of God's power, of divinity, that how God has created everything with its unique identity. And this unique identity is not static, it is dynamic. And here, although it is uh, discussed or analyzed in the in the academic circles, that this concept of inscape is given by Hopkins, but this is something which is common with Wordsworth's concept of spots of time, where Wordsworth talks about when nature reveals divinity, or the divinity is revealed through nature. The same is with the Emerson's concept of moments, or James Joyce's epiphanies. The point is that inscape is a distinctive pattern, a distinctive design which gives every object its individual identity. For example, we know that in a garden there are so many flowers, but this is the color of the marigold which makes it different from rose. This is the fragrance of marigold which makes it different from rose. So every object, whether it is a flower in a garden, whether it is a bird, whether it is an animal, or whether it is an inanimate object, a chair or a table, everything is different from another just because of its distinctive pattern. So this is the concept of inscape. Now comes the next concept of instress. The concept of inscape and instress are interrelated in Hopkins theory. Uh, Hopkins says that the very energy, or he calls it stress of being, which folds the inscape together and carries it to the mind of the observer, means that that very inner energy, that very essence which compels the observer to perceive that very pattern, that is the instress. Or in simple words, we can say the actual experience of the inscape, the actual impression of the inscape on the mind of the observer. That is instress. And this instress is very important for an artist, because Hopkins felt that it was the artist's job to and perceive the inscape and then express that uniqueness, that inscape, into words. So we can say that the apprehension of an object, the realization or the recognition of an object is an intense thirst of energy which enables one to realize its specific distinctiveness. Means an inner energy is there which folds the inscape together and which makes the observer to perceive that inscape. So inscape and instress both convey the uniqueness of each created thing or person and how that individuality perceived or experienced by the observer. Students, मैं आपको बताना चाहूंगी कि इंस्केप से हॉपकिंस का तात्पर्य है कि दुनिया में जितने भी ऑब्जेक्ट्स हैं, चाहे वो इनएनिमेट हैं चाहे एनिमेट हैं, सबकी एक इंडिविजुअल आइडेंटिटी है, क्योंकि गॉड अपने आप को रिपीट नहीं करता और इंडिविजुअल आइडेंटिटी का मतलब है सबका अपना एक डिजाइन और पैटर्न है। जैसा कि मैंने आपको बताया कि एक फ्लावर गार्डन में दूसरे फ्लावर से अलग है, मैरीगोल्ड रोज से अलग क्यों है? कि उसका कलर पैटर्न अलग है, उसका फ्रेग्रेंस पैटर्न अलग है। तो सबका एक डिस्टिंक्टिव पैटर्न है जिसकी वजह से एवरी ऑब्जेक्ट इज यूनिक फ्रॉम ईच अदर। दिस इज द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ इनस्केप। अब इस इनस्केप को एक ऑब्जर्वर, हम मान लें कि एक आर्टिस्ट है, उसको वो कैसे रियलाइज करता है, वो इनस्केप उसके माइंड के ऊपर कैसा इंप्रेशन छोड़ता है, कैसे उसकी मेमोरी और इमेजिनेशन उसको कैच करती है, ये इंस्ट्रेस है। और वो कैसे कब होगा कि एक फोर्स है, एक इनर एनर्जी है जिसकी वजह से वो उसको फील करता है और फिर उसको वर्ड्स के थ्रू एक्सप्रेस करता है। तो कहने का मतलब है कि इनस्केप एक पैटर्न है और इंस्ट्रेस उस पैटर्न का एक्सपीरियंस है, कि उस पैटर्न को हम कैसे एक्सपीरियंस करते हैं। और उस पैटर्न का एक्सपीरियंस एक आर्टिस्ट के लिए बहुत जरूरी हो जाता है, क्योंकि हॉपकिंस ये मानता है कि आर्टिस्ट की ड्यूटी है कि वो उस इनस्केप को परसीव करे, महसूस करे और फिर उसकी यूनिकनेस को वर्ड्स के थ्रू, अपनी पोएम्स के थ्रू, अपने जो भी उसकी आर्ट है उसके थ्रू उसको वो एक्सप्रेस करे। तो इस तरह से हॉपकिंस की थियोरी ऑफ पोइट्री में इनस्केप और इंस्ट्रेस कॉर्नर स्टोन्स हैं, क्योंकि इनस्केप के माध्यम से किसी भी चीज की यूनिकनेस को पोएम में इंस्ट्रेस करना है। मतलब इंस्ट्रेस अगर है, एक इनर एनर्जी है, तभी उस यूनिकनेस को एक पोएट एक्सप्रेस कर पाएगा। और अपनी पोएम्स में इसी इनस्केपिंग के लिए उसने एक और नया इनोवेशन किया, दैट वाज ऑफ स्प्रंग रिदम, क्योंकि हर एक चीज अपने आप में यूनिक है और उस पैटर्न को एक आर्टिस्ट कैसे परसीव करता है ये उसका अपना आउटलुक है। किस तरह से उसको वो वर्ड्स देगा, कैसे वो उस यूनिकनेस को एक्सप्रेस करेगा, दैट इज ए पोएट्स individual idea. So with this very concept in his mind, he make an innovation in English prosody also, that is called sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm is his experiment with metrical pattern of English poetry. And actually this is a metrical arrangement which is inspired by Anglo-Saxon and Greek poetry. And students, this is based on the number of stressed syllables in a line without any specific number of unstressed syllables. Keep in स्टूडेंट्स, हम स्प्रंग रिदम को एक एग्जाम्पल के थ्रू यूं समझते हैं। देखिए, इन रेगुलर मीटर, इन रनिंग रिदम क्या होता है? देयर इज द स्ट्रेस्ड एंड द अनस्ट्रेस्ड सिलेबल्स ऑल्टरनेट इन ए स्पेसिफिक पैटर्न। मींस स्ट्रेस्ड और अनस्ट्रेस्ड सिलेबल एक निश्चित पैटर्न में अरेंज होते हैं। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, दिस इज द फर्स्ट लाइन फ्रॉम थॉमस ग्रेज एलेजी रिटन इन कंट्री चर्चयार्ड. The line goes like this: the curfew tolls the knell of the parting day. Here in this line, as it is visible on your screen, there are 10 syllables and it is divided into 5 units with 2 syllables in each unit. And this unit is called foot, as you all must be familiar with. And in each unit, there are 2 syllables. The first syllable is unstressed and the second one, which is highlighted, is stressed. So if we look closely, we find that every second syllable in this line is stressed. Every second syllable in the third pair, then in the fourth foot, and then in the fifth foot. So, and alternately, the first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. That's why this is called iambic pentameter in regular metrical pattern. But this is not the case with the sprung rhythm. What is there? Let's have a look at an example from Hopkins' poem Spring and Fall. Look, this is the first line of Spring and Fall. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? Now look, the highlighted syllables are the stressed syllables, and if you look that these very lines from Hopkins poem are also divided into units. They are also divided into feet, but if you look at the first unit, you will find that there is the first syllable is stressed, mar, then the another one is g, this is the weak syllable, one weak syllable, one unstressed syllable, means one stressed syllable followed by one unstressed syllable. Then what happens in the second unit, second foot, there is only one stressed syllable, there is no unstressed syllable. Then we come to the third foot. What is there? There is one stressed syllable and one unstressed. The same is there in the fourth one. So the point is that in this line, the number of the stressed syllable is fixed. There are 4 stressed syllables, but the number of unstressed syllable is not fixed. And so the stressed syllable, they seems to be jumping. They seems to be springing at irregular intervals. That's why this is called sprung rhythm. So students, this sprung rhythm is very close to the natural rhythm of common speech, and इसमें किसी तरह के कन्वेंशनल मीट्रिकल फीट आयम्बिक या डॉक्टलिक को फॉलो नहीं किया जाता, और ये वर्ड्स को अपना रिदम क्रिएट करने की फ्रीडम देता है, फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी देता है, और इसको रेगुलर मीटर और फ्री वर्ड्स के बीच का ब्रिज कहा जाता है, क्योंकि इसी के आधार पर बाद में मॉडर्न पोएट्स ने फ्री वर्ड्स को इन्वेंट किया. So this is all about Hopkins' innovation in the field of English prosody, that is called sprung rhythm. Now let's talk about his poem Spring and Fall. It's a beautiful lyric composed in 1880 and it was published in 1918. It is addressed to a young child, Margaret. As the title suggests, this poem is about spring and fall. Spring is the symbol of youth and life, and fall is the symbol of death. And the theme of this poem is the reality of human existence, that is mortality, that is death. And when before talking about the contents or the style of this poem, it would be imperative to know the setting of the poem. The poem begins with a little girl who is standing in a garden and she is crying over the shedding of the leaves in autumn season. And the poem begins with a question to Margaret, that why she is crying. And while questioning the girl, the poet realizes that the weeping of this little girl, Margaret, is her innocent response to the loss, to the fall of leaves. And her response towards loss or fall will change when she will got mature. But the poet is aware of this fact that weeping will also continue. Although when he will get mature, she will be able to understand the cause of the fall, the cause of the loss, but she will keep on weeping. But at that time when she will be aware of the cause of the loss, then she will have a conscious grief. Now there is an intuitive grief because she just innocently cried that something is going away, something is not going to come back. So ultimately when she will get mature, she will realize that this is the ultimate end of life, and this is what man is born for. So this is how through this short lyric, poet has given a message to humanity that sorrow's springs are the same, that the sorrow's cause, the sorrow's root is always the same, and that is the loss or death. When a girl is innocent, she cries over the loss of leaves, and when she will get mature, she will come to realize, she will feel sorry that his life is not going to stay forever. She is not going to stay forever. So this is the very blight, this is the very curse man is born with. This is the message which is given through this poem Spring and Fall. And it's a lyrical poem, and there is a sing-song effect in the first 8 lines. And this poem is a beautiful example of Hopkins' use of sprung rhythm, as I have just discussed earlier, that in the very first line, Margaret, are you grieving? That in this line, there are 4 stressed syllables and there is no fixed number of unstressed syllables. And as far as the poetic diction and figure of speech is concerned, students, if you have the text of this poem before you, you can easily point out that there is the Hopkins' own coinage. He has coined his own compound words like golden groove is for the cluster of trees with yellow leaves, dry yellow leaves. They are called the golden groove. Then there is van wood. Then there is leaf meal. That these are the his own new coinages, his own compound words. Then secondly, there is use of alliteration. Then another one is consonant chime. In the alliteration, look carefully on your screen. There is a phrase heart heard, ghost guessed. The repetitive use of consonantal sounds. This is called consonant chime, and this is excessively used in his poems, and it is the influence of Welsh poetry, because as we have discussed earlier that Hopkins stayed in some time at Dublin, and during that time he came across with Welsh poetry, and just because of the influence of Welsh poetry, he copied this concept of, or this device of consonant chime in his poetry. So this is in brief. I want to tell you through this poem that the spring and fall is a very short lyric, and through this short lyric he has given expression to his very idea, to the very idea or the concept of mortality in his own individual way, and how he has used compound words and alliteration and sprung rhythm. The another poem is The Sea and the Skylark. This poem was composed in 1877 when he was staying at St. Bruno's College. And the theme of this poem is the contrast between the purity of nature and the sordidness of the civilization created by man. The setting of the poem begins with the description of 2 natural sounds, the sound of the sea waves breaking against the seashore and the sound of the skylark singing in the air. So the 2 sounds are audible to the poet. And the poet is fascinated by the purity of these 2 sounds, and toward the end of the poem, the poet proceeds to contrast with the shallow and to contrast these very pure sounds with the shallow and frail town inhabited by man. So the poem ends with a deep sense of loss at the thought of the total decline of human race. So through this sonnet, the poet has again given a philosophical and message that we, the human beings, lives, pride, and cared for crown, because human beings are considered to be the acme of God's creation. We have lost that cheer and charm of earth's prime. We have lost that magic which was given to us by divine powers. As far as the stylistic features of this poem are concerned, this poem is a regular Petrarchan sonnet divided into two parts, octave and chastet. Students, if you have the text of this poem before you, you can easily point out the poetic diction and figures of speech. There is also use of compound words and coinage, just like the another poem Spring and Fall we have just discussed. There are two coinage which are very important to know. One is rash fresh, another is new skinned, and these two phrases, these two compound words, they add obscurity to this very poem. And even when words Hopkins sent this poem to his friend Robert Bridges, he himself also not able to understand these very coinages. So Hopkins wrote in a letter and explained these phrases to his friend Robert Bridges. So this is how that the creation of these very coinage has created obscurity in his poems. Then there is use of alliteration in the line 3, if you have the text before you, with a flood or a fall, low, lull off, and all roar. There is the repetition of f and l sounds. Then again, here is the consonant chime, the influence of Welsh poetry. This is so clearly perceived in the line 7, in the crisps of curl of wild winch whirl, that k and w sounds are repetitively used. Then onomatopoeic effect with skillful patterning of vowel and consonantal sounds in the first two quadrants is also noteworthy. Then there is the use of complex metaphor, that how he has compared the song of the skylark with the skin of wool. The subtle use of repetition also draws our attention, that the poet has used year and year, then make and making, break and are breaking. This is all there in this poem as part of Hopkins' experimentation with poetic diction and figure of speech. And above all, this is the part of the way he has tried to inscape his surroundings in his poetry in his own individual way. So students, this is an overview of G.M. Hopkins' journey as a poet, and I hope now you have a clear idea that this influential poet was much ahead of his times with his greatest innovations of in the field of poetry, with the concepts of inscape and instress and the use of sprung rhythm. Keep reading Hopkins' poem and keep exploring more and more about this great creative genius. Thank you.